Hello and welcome to the history of Maritime Wrestling. This episode we will be talking about mainstream wrestling. Truth be told, I don't know a lot about mainstream wrestling. I'm going off cagematch.net and the videos that are on New Scott's YouTube channel. So if I do miss anything important, I do apologize. Mainstream wrestling was started by Devin Shiddick. Devin Shiddick wrestled as X-Ray Kyle Cruz in mainstream wrestling. The earliest card I could find is from July 9th, 1999. At this point in time, only Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling were running shows in the Maritimes. There's a case to be made that mainstream wrestling is the first independent wrestling promotion out of the Maritimes. A lot of people still considered Grand Prix Wrestling in 1999 territory wrestling, and Real Action Wrestling was still a few months away from being born. On the first card I could find on cagematch.net would have wrestlers like Too Sweet Champagne, Mr. Twister, Grievance, Dark Star, Sledgehammer Spike, and X-Ray Kyle Cruz. Mainstream wrestling would introduce two championship belts in the year 2000. The first one was the Mainstream Wrestling New Brunswick Championship belt. Black Death would be the first New Brunswick champion after he beat Sledgehammer Spike. The second championship belt would be the Mainstream Wrestling Heavyweight Championship, which was won by Sledgehammer Spike after he won a Battle Royal on November 25th. On January 27, 2001, Firefly would beat Black Death to win the New Brunswick heavyweight title. Firefly is better known today as Lincoln Steen. On April 28, 2001, the Mainstream Wrestling Junior Heavyweight title would be introduced and won by X-Ray Kyle Cruz. Kyle Cruz won a Battle Royal to be crowned champion. Later on in 2001, Mainstream Wrestling would stop using the New Brunswick heavyweight title. On July 21st, the MSW heavyweight title would be vacated. The same night the title was vacated, it was won by Lincoln Steen after he beat Jeremiah Delinquent. Jeremiah Delinquent would later on wrestle as Scott Savage. On September 21st, 2001, Outcast would win the junior heavyweight title from X-Ray Kyle Cruz. On November 30th, Jeremiah Delinquent would beat Lincoln Steen to win the Mainstream Wrestling heavyweight title. Other wrestlers wrestling for Mainstream Wrestling in 2001 would include Sledgehammer Spike, Tommy Schuyler, Colonel Cypress, Triple XL, Fusion, Mr. Twister, Maximus, Michael Kelly Smith, Joey Bumps, Jerry Martel, Quincy Valentino, Mentalo, Damian Dredd, Vance Nevada, Cameo, Flex Falcone, Contraband, Jacob Voorhees, Jeff Puggs, Cliff McDonald, Chuck Matrix, Chad Tatum, and Rob Stardom. On April 29, 2002, Flex Falcone would win the Mainstream Wrestling heavyweight title in a three-way match. Also involved in that match would be the champion Jeremiah Delinquent and Lincoln Steen. On July 27, 2002, the Rampage Pro Wrestling heavyweight title would be on the line when Jerry Martel beat the champion Sonny Soprano to win the championship. Sonny Soprano would later on wrestle in the Maritimes as Sonny Rosselli, and Rampage Pro Wrestling was a promotion from the United States in Maine. Rampage Pro Wrestling was active from 2001 to 2003. On April 24th in Halifax, Nova Scotia, we would see three title matches in one card. The first title match would see Lincoln Steen win the Canadian Unified Junior Heavyweight Championship in a three-way ladder match involving Jeremiah Delinquent, who was the champion, and Sweet Sarah. Sweet Sarah is also known as Sarah Stock. Also that night, the CEW North Atlantic title would be on the line when Colonel Cypress won the title from Too Damn Hip. CEW is Cutting Edge Wrestling, and they were from St. John's, Newfoundland, and they started in 1998. According to cagematch.net, they have not had a show since 2020. The main event on the August 24th show was for the vacant Mainstream Wrestling Junior Heavyweight title. Legion Cage beat former champion X-Ray Kyle Cruz. On August 27th, we would see two rematches as Sonny Soprano would win back the Rampage Pro Wrestling Heavyweight title from Jerry Martel, and later that night, Too Damn Hip would win back the CEW North Atlantic Championship from Colonel Cypress. In 2003, the Mainstream Wrestling Heavyweight title would be vacated, and Tony Armstrong would win the vacant title on April 24th after winning a Battle Royal. On May 15th, Jeremiah Delinquent would beat Lincoln Steen to win back the Canadian Unified Junior Heavyweight Championship. Delinquent would not be champion for very long. On May 22, Jeremiah Delinquent would lose the Canadian Unified Junior Heavyweight title to Blue Antares. Just a few days later, Lincoln Steen would win back the Canadian Unified Junior Heavyweight Championship. And a few days after that, Jeremiah Delinquent would beat Lincoln Steen to win back the Canadian Unified Junior Heavyweight Championship. It was a bit of a hot potato there. In 2003, Chi Cruz would join Mainstream Wrestling and start feuding with the champion Tony Armstrong. Chi Cruz would win the Mainstream Wrestling Heavyweight title from Tony Armstrong, but not long after, Tony Armstrong would win back the title. This match has been preserved by Newscott and is available on YouTube. X-Ray Kyle Cruz would beat Jeremiah Delinquent to win the Canadian Unified Junior Heavyweight Championship. In July, the Mainstream Wrestling Junior Heavyweight title would be renamed to the Mainstream Wrestling Atlantic title. The belt was vacated and Scott Phoenix beat Legion Cage to win the vacant title. On August 28th, Jeremiah Delinquent would win back the Canadian Unified Junior Heavyweight title. 1 month later, Jeremiah Delinquent would lose his title to Flex Falcone. On September 25th, Paco Loco would win the MSW Atlantic Championship after beating Scott Phoenix. In October, the MSW Heavyweight Championship would change hands as Jeremiah Delinquent would beat Tony Armstrong to win the title. 1 month later, Tony Armstrong would win back the Mainstream Wrestling Heavyweight title from Jeremiah Delinquent. The last show of 2003 would see X-Ray Kyle Cruz win the MSW Atlantic title in a three-way match versus Outcast and CN Power. And the main event that night would see Lincoln Steen win the MSW Heavyweight Championship versus Tony Armstrong. At the beginning of 2004, Mainstream Wrestling would have a partnership with North Atlantic Wrestling Association. NAWA was based out of Maine. In May of 2004, both Gangrel and the Honky Tonk Man would do shows for Mainstream Wrestling. Marco Estrada would win the MSW Heavyweight Championship, and he would hold the title until April 22, 2005. He would eventually lose the title to Vance Nevada. X-Ray Kyle Cruz would win the vacant MSW Atlantic Championship, and he would defend it multiple times in 2005 before losing the title to Comatose on August 25th. Vance Nevada would lose the MSW Heavyweight title to CN Power. CN Power now wrestles as Sidewalk Sam. On October 20th, Trash Canyon beat Comatose to win the MSW Atlantic Championship. Also in 2005, Cowboy Mike Hughes would wrestle for Mainstream Wrestling under the name of Hangman Hughes. In 2006, Trash Canyon would lose the MSW Atlantic Championship to Randy Relapse. On June 25th, CN Power would lose the MSW Heavyweight Championship to Chris Hamrick. The MSW Atlantic Championship would once again get a name change. It would now be known as the MSW Atlantic Canadian Championship. With the name change, the title would be vacated and would be won by X-Ray Kyle Cruz in a six-way match, also involving Too Damn Hip, Jack Johnson, Maritime Menace, Sexton Phoenix, and Sidewalk Sam. Sexton Phoenix would later on be known as the Dream Killer, Troy Merrick. In 2007, Wildman Gary Williams would start wrestling for Mainstream Wrestling. X-Ray Kyle Cruz would defend the MSW Atlantic Canadian Championship versus Sidewalk Sam and Scott Savage. Scott Savage being the former Jeremiah Delinquent. Kyle Cruz would hold on to the Atlantic Canadian Championship for all of 2007. By 2008, the MSW heavyweight title was around the waist of Grimez. Grimez is 6'11" and nowadays wrestles as Giant Pharaoh. In 2008, X-Ray Kyle Cruz is feuding and defending the MSW Atlantic Canadian Championship versus Cowboy Mike Hughes. In 2009, Grimez is feuding with the Mauler over the MSW heavyweight title. The Mauler would eventually win the MSW heavyweight title. Also in 2009, the MSW Atlantic Canadian Championship would be vacated, but Kyle Cruz would win the vacant title by beating Mike Frazier. The rivalry between Grimez and the Mauler would continue, and Grimez would win back the MSW heavyweight title. In 2010, future Maritime Wrestling legends like Titus, The Big Picture Chris Cook, and Riddick Stone would all wrestle for Mainstream Wrestling. Also appearing in Mainstream Wrestling in 2010 is one of Maritime Wrestling's biggest legends, Brody Steele. In 2012, X-Ray Kyle Cruz would lose the MSW Atlantic Canadian Championship to Michel Mollet. But not long after this, the title would change hands again as Alexander Saint would win the championship. By 2013, Jeremy Prophet is the MSW Heavyweight Champion, and the MSW Atlantic Canadian Championship is once again vacated. The Atlantic Canadian Championship would be won by Bo Douglas after beating Jason Rumble. Also in 2013, for the first time ever, Mainstream Wrestling would get tag team championships. The first champions would be Los Conquistadors, after they beat the tag team of Rags and Riches. This is Bo Douglas and Sidewalk Sam. Los Conquistadors were Kyle Cruz and Jason Rumble under hoods. Later on in the year, Rags and Riches would win the MSW tag team titles. 2013 would also see Jason Rumble beat Jeremy Prophet to win the MSW heavyweight title, and by the end of 2013, the MSW tag team titles would be abandoned. Also in 2013, X-Ray Kyle Cruz would change his name to Forrest Cullen. This was a vampire character. In 2014, Mainstream Wrestling would introduce a women's title. The first champion would be Sarah Stock, after she won a three-way match versus Bambi Hall and Serena Deeb. She would not be champion for very long though, as she would lose the title to Bambi Hall. In 2015, Forrest Cullen would win the vacant MSW heavyweight title by winning a battle royal. At this point, Mainstream Wrestling was over 15 years old, and this was Devin Shiddick's first heavyweight title in his own promotion. Narcissus Saint would win the vacant Atlantic Canadian title after beating El Fuego Dragon. Bushwhacker Luke would be on shows in 2015. Also in 2015, Mainstream Wrestling is working with NWE out of Miramichi. NWE would even have some of their titles defended on Mainstream Wrestling shows. In 2016, Sabotage, Justin Newhook, and Matt Connors would work for Mainstream Wrestling. Also in 2016, Jason Rumble would beat Forrest Cullen to win the MSW heavyweight title. In 2017, Kobe Christ and Wesley Pipes would wrestle for Mainstream Wrestling. 2017 would also see Ryan Heath win the vacant Mainstream Wrestling heavyweight title. The future Moondog Dylan Davis, at this point in time wrestling as Dynamite Dylan Davis, would win the MSW heavyweight title from Ryan Heath. In 2018, Kirk O'Bey would win the MSW heavyweight title from Dylan Davis. As of this recording, Kirk O'Bey is the final Mainstream Wrestling heavyweight champion. According to CageMatch.net, Mainstream Wrestling only had 3 shows from 2020 to 2023. Mainstream Wrestling should be remembered as a promotion that kept the maritime wrestling scene alive when there was nothing else going on. And that's the story of mainstream wrestling. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next week.